Everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here. Honored to have been invited to feature in the program. This is a joint work with Elena Bobejka and Isabel Fanstenkiste, European Central Bank. The views expressed in this paper are only ours and not from the European Central Bank or the Eurosystem. The paper is still preliminary. It's been prepared for this conference. So if you want to quote it, please ask for our permission. So what is the paper about, and why do we want to do something like this? This is a purely empirical paper, which tries to analyze the link between inflation and labor cost. In a sense, I'm not sure we want to address also causality issues, although it's inevitable. But clearly, labor costs are an important part of business cost, and therefore, in the cost push theory, the idea that if you have an exogenous increase in wages, this translates, or prices, if firms have a pricing power to translate into prices, it's something that it's in the economic theory. Now, from a monetary policy perspective, this is a key issue as well. A better understanding of the signal between labor cost developments and inflationary processes is key, because you want to forecast inflation to set your monetary policy. And maybe wages are, a key determinant of inflation. Now, the recent rhetoric, not just of the ECB, but of other central banks, is actually there is a link between wages and inflation. The same way as before the crisis, the ECB and other central banks were saying we are worried that there are cost push pressures on inflation. After the crisis, this is actually it becomes sort of a hope. If wages go up, then there is the idea that inflation go up as well. As said, the ECB is not the only one actually vocalizing that. Bank of England, Bank of Japan. The only exception is the Fed recently, also based on some papers, which actually argue that the link between inflation, between labor costs and inflation, has actually faded over the years. I have something to say about this later. I have some reference on the US as well, but the paper is only on euro area. Now, economic theory is consistent with both views, of both causality from cost to prices and from prices to cost. I don't think I have too much time to go through all the literature, which is extensive, especially for the US. For the US part, but at least the empirical one. But as said, from a theory perspective, the causality can go both ways. You can even imagine that outside the new Keynesian theory, firms may charge whatever the market will bear, regardless of their actual cost, if they believe that the market can bear that. And so this is not exactly in line with the cost push model. Our fundamental idea in this paper is that this empirical link should be seen as conditional, mainly conditional on the state of the economy and conditional on the shocks driving the economy. And that's what is driving our paper. The empirical evidence is huge for the US, as usual, scant for the euro area. For the US, there is no conclusive evidence of this link, and as I said, recently, actually, there is the tendency of fading away of this link, and actually the rhetoric of the Fed is not based anymore on this. For the euro area, there is something, and that's why we actually want to write a paper on this and do something systematic. So let's collect what we have done also at the ECB for several years, and let's see what exists, and then let's try to establish an empirical relationship with this idea that the relationship is actually not unconditional, but it's conditional on state and state of the economy and shock. And that's what motivates this. So what we are going to do is an empirical exploration of the wage price link in the 4 biggest euro areas, so Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. But we also have sectoral data. And so we have 3 sectors, manufacturing, construction, and services. And the total economy. And so the main policy question is the ECB rhetoric justified? The academic question is, there are 3 questions, basically, whether such a link empirically exists, can be motivated, this link, whether this depends on the state of the economy, in particular on the level of inflation, and does this link depend on the shock hitting the economy. So that's going to be the outline of the remaining part of the talk. I say something, because it's an empirical paper, I say something on data. I briefly mention on what's the unconditional evidence, purely correlation and Granger causality, usual stuff, and then some more conditional evidence, and then I summarize and try to put in perspective. The paper, as I said, is still preliminary. The thing that is, there are a couple of things missing. One of the things is, to make sense of some of these results in terms of countries, sectors, so we have some rich data. So let's start with data then. So I said we collected data at sectoral level for 4 countries, 3 sectors and the total economy. We have 3 main variables which are part of our analysis. The real value added of the sector, the real value added deflator, and productivity adjusted compensation per employee, which is going to be our measure of its unit labor cost measure. Now, clearly, there are measurement issues here. We want to have a balanced kind of panel, and to have a balanced panel, you have to sacrifice other things. So we basically chose the available data, at least since the 80s, and that's why we came up with these 3. Real value added for output, value added deflator for the price inflation, and compensation per employee as a measure of wages. Of course, we know that's not the best measure of wages, correct, so adjusted for productivity, so to get a measure of unit labor cost. So we have a robustness check, which we actually enlarge the empirical analysis, using also unemployment. Employment is not available at the sector level, it's available at the country level. And also something on the monetary policy stance. The reason why we don't have monetary policy directly into this analysis here, we will see it's a VAR-based analysis, is also because we do it sector by sector, and so it's going to be a little bit difficult to have okay, it's possible. I have other papers which do that, but we leave this, for next. Remember, this is a very preliminary paper, so. And so the reason why we want to go disaggregate is because there are institutional settings which are different across countries, across sectors, especially in the labor market. The degree of global exposure to international competition is different across sectors. The degree of wage and price rigidity, of course, is different. So the ECB and the Eurosystem of central banks produced a wage dynamic network right after the crisis or during the crisis. I think there's been a follow-up. There are many results which still hold, I think. We refer to those results. I actually encourage you to read the report. I think it's published at least as an ECB working paper or occasional paper. So one important issue is what do we do with this data? Which transformation we get? So central banks like year-on-year growth rate, and that's what we take. Of course, econometricians know that this transformation may have some problems. Let's put this problem aside for the time being. There is one issue which we want to understand. So from a theoretical point of view, we consider that in the long run, the productivity-adjusted wages and price inflation, they share a common trend. And so what we do is we remove this common trend. The issue is, what is this common trend? So we have tried several things, but at the end, we actually use as a common trend the consensus survey-based long-run inflation expectations. This is probably the safest way of approaching this trend, also because with an unobserved component, it's an unobserved component model, so you don't have a way to justify it. This is based on surveys or professional forecasters. Maybe it's more justified. For the thing is, we remove a common trend. And this adjustment can be actually crucial. So this is the data, just to have an idea. This is for the total economy, but basically it looks like this for all sectors. So there is a lot of commonality, a lot of co-movement between prices and wage and productivity adjusted wage. And also the trend, you see there is a downward kind of trend for the 4 economies. Now, this is the trend that we are going to remove, based, as said, on the survey of professional, on the consensus for the economies. It's a common, so across all sectors is the same. And why we do that? So ex post, we try to rationalize also. Look at this chart, for instance. So this is the scatter plot of labor cost growth and inflation. Now, on the left upper panel, or the left panel, you actually have this also split into pre-crisis and post-crisis. If you don't filter this data with this common trend, what happens is that you clearly see a positive relationship, but if you split the sample, say after the crisis, you see a tendency to actually this relationship to be lower than before. If you actually detrend, this is what happens on the right side. And the same things happen for US. So we think some of the results based on US data are actually don't detrend. And of course, it's clearly here it becomes an econometric issue, and so we leave this for the debate. So, but this is also an ex post rationalization of why we think also can be a good idea to detrend, because otherwise you can get the results, which you actually do in the data, that you can observe a changing over time of this relationship in an unconditional form, which actually does not happen when you detrend. So on the unconditional evidence, said this is basically, the first thing you do as an econometrician is you just check correlations and Granger causality, some forecasting power. And that's what I did. The main results are this. The correlation is high, as you have seen also from the scatter plot. This correlation is high at the contemporaneous, but also league-led. There is no pattern, specific pattern. This is the chart of the cross-correlation, for instance, for countries and sectors. You don't really see, you see mostly contemporaneous and some leading leg, but not really a specific, something that you can say across specific sectors you have a given dynamics that you don't have in other sectors. One other thing that we did was the direction of causality. This is not obvious. We find basically the same thing as in the literature, so it's not really obvious to say labor costs cause inflation or the other way around. But it can actually, you can find an econometric specification which gives you some Granger causality from wages to prices, and also some forecasting power. The exercise we did for forecasting were just a simple unconditional one in which you have a model where you have a unit labor cost and inflation, and then a model without unit labor cost, and then you project inflation and see whether you gain something. You don't really gain a lot, but if you do an unconditional, and these are results on the forecast evaluation, if you do it in a conditional sense, say you project inflation conditional on the path of unit labor cost, if you take the true path of unit labor cost, then you can really improve a lot in some sectors, versus, say, keeping the unit labor cost constant, okay? So you can do many exercises. Again, there is just a way of setting the scene and saying there is some unconditional relationship between the two, there is some in-sample or out-of-sample forecasting power, but that's still not enough because these are based on, unconditional thing. And on the Granger causality, these are, for instance, the p-values for countries and sectors, and you can see, for Italy, for instance, so this is p-value of having unit labor cost in an equation for inflation, and so the null hypothesis, these coefficients are 0. And then you can see actually that, especially for Italy, you have some change at some point. For Germany, there is almost always some forecasting, Granger causality, and for Spain as well. France is the only one which is a bit different. It will be different also, you will see the conditional results. France is a different case, and we still have, as I said, we still have to make sense of it. Maybe with the help of the discussant and your comments, that's gonna happen. So from an unconditional point of view, it's true, there is some correlation. We have to make sense of this correlation. There is some forecasting power. There is some Granger causality. But the trick I used in this econometric specification is I actually use the Granger causality as the criterion to see whether there is Granger causality. It's a bit circular, but okay, you can read the paper and see. I actually, basically, I'm searching for a specification which gives you a Granger causality. And in terms of legs only, and it actually happens. But it's just, instead of choosing the leg based on another criteria, I choose the Granger causality test as a criteria. And of course, it's a bit circular, and you can say, okay, you're saying the same. But okay, this is just an unconditional kind of evidence. So there is nothing really absolutely new here. So let me move to the other part, which is the conditional part. And for conditional evidence, we just use a basic model, so a VAR analysis. okay, some of you know that my main research has been on a panel VAR model. So the first question is, why don't you just put everything together and do a big panel VAR analysis? True, this can be done. But again, I mean, you start simple, and what we started was just 16 VARs, one for each sector, including the total economy, and for each country. The three main variables are the real value added, the unit labor cost as defined before, and value added deflator as defined before. So they are actually in deviation from a common trend. The estimation period is from 85 to 2018, and for this we have a balanced kind of panel. I said we don't use the panel, we will do it in the future if needed. So 16 VR are estimated with 4 legs in principle, with some Bayesian techniques, just to to get some uncertainty, but that's not really essential there. The first identification with this is Cholesky, so with the ordering that you see there. And then what we do is basically compute a pass-through as, you shock unit labor cost, given this Cholesky order, so there's an exogenous shock that you don't name. It hits unit labor cost, so how is prices reacting, okay? And we compute, dynamic multipliers, the ratio of cumulative impulse response function of price inflation and ULC after a shock to ULC. So it's a, standard, very simple exercise. What do we find? So first of all, let me compute also VR-based correlations. So Jordi Gali had this in a paper in '99, for instance. This is, some you just you take the VR, you put it in moving average representation, compute the correlations, and you compute the correlations conditional to all shocks or conditional to shocks hitting each of the variables. We are still in the Cholesky framework here, so there is no proper structural identification, but still. And so the first thing you see is that these correlations are actually very high, both conditional on all shocks and conditional on shocks hitting output prices and ULC. In particular, the shocks hitting ULC is actually giving us the highest correlation. We are talking about correlation of the order of 0.7, 0.8, even 0.96 for the total economy in Spain. So these are really high correlations. Okay? When I say conditionally, it's because this is a VAR and you are conditioning on the dynamic of the other variables. That's what I call condition. So that's the first thing. Now, let's look at the pass-through. So what we call the pass-through, so shock to ULC, compute the impulse response of prices, and do this dynamic multiplier ratio. And this is what you get. We have all the results for all sectors and their confidence bands. Here I'm reporting just the median for sectors. So yellow is service, green is construction, blue is manufacturing, red is total economy. So the first thing you can see that seems to have France is has on average the highest pass-through. And Spain may be the lowest. Germany and Italy are in between. So as said, we're trying to make sense of these results. In the paper, we thought maybe there's going to be a section on, say, country case or something like that. I mean, France is a highly unionized, or used to be at least, unionized country. So there's, this link also is the country where the probability of having second round effects is probably bigger. Italy, there's also some formal indexation. Spain, there is no indexation. Germany, not sure. So I'm not really an expert of the labor market, so this is something that we really have to make sense. But this is one of the results. So there is a pass-through. It's not zero, and the highest is for France. And the thing is that if we want to square these results to previous results, say take the wage dynamic network I was quoting before. So there's one result in that analysis of firm data, which says the sectors or the firms which have a higher labor share, actually the one where there is a higher pass-through. Well, we don't really find this here, apart from France, where if you look at, these are the labor shares, construction has the highest labor share in France and also in Germany. And if you see Germany, services, and Italy has the lowest labor share, and in terms of pass-through is actually the highest pass-through. So you can really confirm. Of course, the caveat here is this is labor share. In sectors, there the analysis was done at the firm level. It was a survey-based analysis. So again, you have to take this cum grano salis. Another thing we said was, okay, we are in a conditional world. What happens if actually we have a different actually regime in inflation. So I don't really have a regime switching kind of model, but I can run two estimation under two different, say one for inflation above average and one from inflation below average, and compute the same pass-through. And this is what happens. The red one, this is for total economy, but it actually is very consistent all through all sectors except construction in Italy. But what it's saying is that the red line is with the confidence band is actually the pass-through under high inflation. Let's put high inflation. It's inflation above average. So I don't really have a lot of sample to say take the upper quantile or the lower quantile. So, but still, you see, quite some difference across, the two kind of state, which makes us conclude that this relationship can indeed be state dependent. This is nothing, again, entirely new. There was a paper by John Taylor in 2000, which actually we use also to sort of make sense of these results, which point to the same. At the time was a discussion on having, a low inflation and low pricing power of firms. Here the idea is very similar. So empirically, in the euro area, across sectors, systematically, you find such a result. So you find that if you run this regression on two separate samples, it's like a dummy approach, you actually find a difference, a significant difference. So I just before, that's not in the paper, but if I put a common monetary policy shock in all these VARs, I actually get similar results. But this is something on which I need to work, and still need to think how to introduce, controlling for monetary policy, because clearly monetary policy is the elephant in this room that I'm showing there. Okay, so that was the first part. So we can move a little bit farther now. So we went. So the paper go from a simple unconditional one to a slowly, a conditional based on a VR in which you don't have an identification in terms of shocks with names. So there are exogenous shocks that are eating the economy, and then we can go a step further again, and then we say, okay, what happens if we try to give names to these shocks and identify, say, at least demand and supply shock? We do this with a sign restriction analysis. Again, we are playing a lot with this. Results are very much robust. So what I show here are representative of saying. So what we do here is so with sign restriction, we say demand is something that increases both output and prices, and supply is something that increases output but decreases prices. We just leave unrestricted ULC. We have tried also, because ULC is the difference, as I said, between nominal wages and productivity. And so giving a positive sign to ULC means that wages are increasing more than productivity. Giving a negative sign means that wages are increasing less than productivity. So we want to, just be agnostic there. But this is an important issue. So what we do here, it's basically two experiments. One experiment is, it's two counterfactuals. One counterfactual is, I want to see the correlations between, the same correlations as before, between prices and wages, but now conditional on shocks. So shock on demand, shock on supply. And so basically, so what would be the counterfactual of prices and wages only under if the economy were hit by a demand shock or by a supply shock? And the other counterfactual is I actually want to use wages or ULC as a channel, an amplification channel. So what happens if I have a demand shock or a supply shock and I shut down this channel? Okay, so these are two kinds of exercise which can tell you different things. So the second one is more saying a way of formalizing the pass-through from wages to prices. Say how much amplification do I get if I have wages into this, or now the tricky part here is that you don't have a Cholesky. With a Cholesky, that's a very simple exercise to do. And there are many papers, including I have a paper on this. There is some other papers, I don't remember now the name, Wang, I think, Sims and someone else. So in which, this is, okay, how counterfactual in a VR is debatable. We know that, right? So how do you set up a counterfactual? But okay, we take one way of doing it, and we just say under. But the tricky part here is that you have shocks which are named, and under Cholesky it's really easy because you just shut down one of the channel. But then what is the shock that you are using to shut this down? And that's why this makes this analysis a bit tricky. Okay, so I'm not sure you get it, all of it. I neither, but that's it's one way of looking at the same thing only from a conditional perspective. So what happens if we do that? Let me show you. So these are the counterfactual wages and prices under demand shock. You see there is a lot of correlation, but you also see that it's clearly obvious that prices are leading wages. Okay, and if you do a lead-lag correlations, you do find exactly the same. This is for the total economy, but for other sectors is very much similar. So I think the paper reports all of them. This is for the supply. So if I actually make this the counterfactual of prices and wages, or ULC. When I say wages, so it's ULC. Given by only supply shocks, that you see that this correlation is not as high as before. It can even be negative. It is actually in some cases. But if there is some league-led relationship, you actually you find more wages leading prices. Well, you can actually compute these correlations. That's what we have done. So this chart here reports the black bar is the demand, the correlations of labor and of ULC and inflation under demand shocks. The gray bar is under supply shocks, and the circles. So the black circles are the lag for the maximum correlation, which you read on the right-hand side part of the chart. She says in negative territory there, which means that prices lead wages, whereas for supplies all in positive territory, and which means wages are actually leading prices. So this is one way of saying how that the correlation between the two is completely different if we actually are under demand shocks or supply shocks. So that's one way of saying this. The other was the other counterfactual, right? Remember the counterfactual was I under demand shock or supply shock, I shut down the channel of wages and see how much I amplify the impulse response function of prices. And what happens here is that, okay, this is a difficult chart to explain. So you have to explain this, you have two impulse responses, okay? One under the full system and one of the prices. So one impulse response of inflation under the full system and one impulse response of inflation under the system where you have shut down wages, okay? The difference between the two is basically giving you how much, wages are important for prices. And this chart here is giving you under demand shock or supply shock for all countries and sectors here. And the blue part here is where this distance is significant, okay? And the diamond there is saying where is the peak, the maximum distance between the two. So visually, you just say, demand shock are much more important than supply shock. They're also more persistent if you want. And the maximum lag happens to be sometime, most of the times, or a period which is longer, higher than under supply shock. Well, one thing we say, okay, this is a small VR, 3 variables, let's robustify it, right? But you cannot robustify at a sector level because we don't have the data. And what we can do is, use the country just for the total economy. And we have a bigger VR in which we have not only real value added prices and wage, but so we split unit labor cost now in two parts. One is wages and one is productivity, because maybe what we called supply before, it's a combination of many things. It can be, technological supply, it can be labor supply, it can be wage markup. And so you want to be able to say something on that. And that's what we try to do here by splitting ULC into wages and productivity and by adding unemployment rate, which is available at the country level and not at the sector level. Identify demand and supply, labor and wage markup in a standard kind of way in this literature, but you still find the same result, okay? So what we call supply, actually you can see that the previous results are most likely labor, what we can label as labor supply shock, more than technological shock. So the summary of this is here, but I think I covered all of it. So the pass-through is bigger and more significant when the economy is hit by a demand and a supply shock. The peak occurs at a higher lag for demand-type shocks. And the pass-through is also more persistent, and the result seems to be robust to a richer specification, at least for the total economy. We cannot say much about sectors. And that's basically it. So let me summarize what we find, this preliminary exploration of the link between wages and prices in the euro area across countries. So remember, the reason why we use countries is because before the crisis it was almost taboo talking about countries in the euro area. Euro area is a single entity. Then you realize that actually that's not the case. The data that you have for euro area is an aggregation of countries, and these countries are very heterogeneous, or can be very heterogeneous. Even so, even if you go at the sector level. Heterogeneity is important from an econometric point of view, because if you use aggregate data beforehand, you get biased result if there is heterogeneity in the data. So you want to use disaggregated data, eventually aggregate them up. And that's what we try to do here. The summary is there is a cost push view of inflation which has some support in the euro area data. There is a high, although imperfect, pass-through. So there is no one, the pass-through is not one, except for one sector in France, for instance, from cost to prices. And this is in line with available firm-level evidence that I was quoting at the beginning, the wage dynamic network. This link between price and ULC is heterogeneous across countries and across sectors, but it very much depends on the state of the economy. The experiment we have done is on the level of inflation. So for high inflation level, or for inflation level above average, you actually have a pass-through which is higher than for inflation level below average. And the pass-through seems to depend on the shock hitting the economy. So this is a way of saying, another way of saying, this relationship, key relationship, Phillips curve, or this kind of relationship, there's some nonlinearity, and this nonlinearity must be explained somewhere. And this is what we are saying, basically. And demand shock seems to be more important than supply shocks. Now, as I said, we are trying to rationalize the result here. So why do we have higher pass-through in France and not in Germany? Clearly, the difference in the institutions matter. France, there is a prominent role of unions. There is some informal wage indexation, which you don't find, for instance, in Spain. And again, so this can give you, because we're not talking about, so this is giving you some idea about, second round effects, if you want, as well, and how important is, in the negotiation of wages, the fact that, your expectation of inflation and vice versa, right? From a theoretical point of view, or some existing, so first of all, one of the way of interpreting the lack of causal relationship between the two in the data is that you have to condition on something. So you have to condition on the state of the economy, on the shocks hitting the economy. Why is the pass-through higher under high inflation? Well, this is consistent with several stories. As I mentioned before, this expectation theory mentioned by Taylor in 2000, the search intensity of consumer, another theory which can say that with the low inflation, if there is a shock, the consumers move and search for the best prices, and so the pricing power of firms is more contained, whereas in the high inflation that's not happening, and so this can be another story. There is the uncertainty related to higher degree of uncertainty associated with high inflation regime, which induces firms to avoid buffering with margins, basically, or intertemporal smoothing of the profit path, if you want. So if you know that we are under high inflation regime, monetary policy is going to act, and so this is going to squeeze my margins anyway in the future, so maybe I prefer not to squeeze the margin now. I don't know. I'm just, these are kind of possible interpretation. Why firms are more willing to increase prices and with positive demand shocks? Again, there are in other studies which have to do with the pass-through from cost, say exchange rate pass-through. So this happens. It can happen that demand shock increase the share of high-income consumers with lower demand elasticity, which gives more pricing power to firms, and more ability to transfer these onto prices. I want to finish with this current implication and the fact that results seems to support the current ECB forecast narrative, which relies on the pickup in wage growth for the one in underlying inflation. Under the current circumstances of predominantly demand shocks, which we document in a recent economic bulletin, the findings give us confidence that the expected increase in unit labor cost is actually supporting underlying inflation in the euro area. However, and that's the answer to the question, is this rhetoric completely justified? Well, it depends. These results call also for patience, because coming from a period of low inflation, the pass-through could be moderate, at least until inflation stably reaches a sustained path. Again, this is a first preliminary empirical investigation, and if you want to quote these results, please ask me for permission, which most likely will be denied for the time being. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks. I think
Thank you very much, Matteo, for a very dynamic presentation and